The industrial outskirts of Ironvale were the kind of place dragons were never meant to be, all steel bones and oil-slicked concrete, where the air tasted of smoke rather than magic and the ground thrummed with machines instead of ancient ley lines, which was why the disappearance of 3 dragon hatchlings from the nearby volcanic ridges baffled their brood beyond reason. For weeks, the parents scoured the skies and scorched valleys, interrogated lesser beasts, and even risked flying low over human territory in desperation, expecting at every turn to find bones, scorch marks, or the cruel evidence of hunters. Yet there was nothing. No blood, no fire residue, no trail that made sense. The hatchlings had simply vanished, as if swallowed by the world itself. Unknown to them, far below the clouds and far from any place dragons would think to search, a human mechanic named Rowan Hale lay asleep on a battered couch in his garage, one grease-stained hand dangling off the edge, the other resting instinctively over 3 warm, unfamiliar shapes curled against his bare chest. Rowan was not a hero, not a soldier, not even particularly brave by reputation. He fixed engines, patched machines that others gave up on, and lived alone after choosing a quiet life over the noise of cities and wars. He had found the hatchlings by accident weeks earlier while working late, drawn by a strange rattling sound near the exhaust bay behind his shop, expecting a trapped animal or malfunctioning pipe, only to discover 3 soot-smudged, half-starved dragonlings huddled inside a warm vent, their tiny fires flickering weakly as if struggling to stay alive. Fear had come a second later, sharp and rational, but it had been overridden by something more immediate, the sight of living creatures that clearly did not know how to survive in a world of metal and machines. Rowan had done the only thing he knew how to do, improvised. He rerouted heat lines, fed them scraps of energy cells and mineral oil until he figured out what they could safely metabolize, and let them sleep where they always crawled back to, on his chest, where the steady vibration of a human heartbeat and the warmth of a working body seemed to calm their unstable flames. He never tried to cage them, never thought of profit or leverage, never reported them, because every time one startled awake and flared instinctively, it only settled when he was still, breathing slow, hands open. Over time, the dragonlings bonded not to the garage, but to Rowan himself, following him like clumsy shadows, curling against him at night, their fires synchronizing unconsciously with his pulse. When the brood parents finally traced the disappearance not by scent or magic but by the sudden absence of uncontrolled flame in the mountains, they followed that void to Ironvale with dread thick in their chests, fully expecting to tear apart a human den and reclaim what remained. What they found instead froze them mid-descent. A human mechanic asleep beneath flickering work lights, chest bare, oil-stained and vulnerable, 3 healthy dragon hatchlings sprawled across him in absolute trust, wings draped over his shoulders, tiny flames reduced to gentle warmth that never once scorched human skin. The parents braced for carnage and found peace so complete it felt like an accusation, because whatever had happened here had not been taken by force, and the realization that their children had chosen to stay was far more terrifying than the idea that they had been stolen. The brood parents hovered in the shadows of twisted steel and hanging chains, their massive forms barely contained by the narrow industrial canyon around the garage, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that dragons did not belong among rust and oil, and yet the undeniable proof of their children's calm made violence feel suddenly obscene. The mother's talons gouged shallow furrows into concrete as she restrained herself from landing too hard, because even the shift of displaced air might wake the hatchlings into panic, and the father's fire pooled uselessly in his throat, trapped by the sight of 3 small chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm against a human body that should have meant danger. Rowan stirred slightly in his sleep, brow creasing as one of the dragonlings shifted, and his hand moved automatically, fingers splayed protectively over scaled warmth without ever fully waking, the gesture so unconscious and intimate that it cut through centuries of draconic certainty like a blade through silk. The parents waited through long, grinding minutes until dawn's pale industrial light filtered through cracked skylights, and only when Rowan finally woke with a startled intake of breath, eyes locking instantly on the immense silhouettes framed by steel beams, did the moment teeter on the edge of catastrophe. He did not scream, did not scramble for tools or weapons, because any sudden movement sent heat spikes rippling through the hatchlings, and he had learned their tells well enough to know that panic would only make things worse. Instead, he raised one hand slowly in clear view, palm open and empty, and spoke in a steady voice that trembled only slightly, explaining without embellishment how he had found them cold and starving, how they had followed him back, how they slept only when close, and how he had been waiting for someone to come for them even as part of him dreaded that moment. The mother listened not for deception but for intent, tasting the air for lies and found none. The father scanned the garage for cages, restraints, evidence of exploitation, and found only improvised warmth, worn blankets, and scorch marks carefully sanded away to protect human skin. When the smallest hatchling finally woke fully and chirred, climbing up Rowan's chest and peering sleepily at its parents before turning back to press its head beneath Rowan's chin, something fundamental shifted, because the choice was visible and uncoerced. The mother landed at last with a controlled grace that cracked the concrete but did not shatter it, lowering her massive head until she was eye level with the human, close enough for Rowan to feel the heat of ancient fire and yet gentle enough not to scorch the air between them. She did not threaten. She asked why. Rowan answered honestly, speaking of machines he had rebuilt because they deserved a second chance, of nights spent fixing what others abandoned, and of how these small creatures had crawled into his arms like broken engines looking for warmth, and how he had never been able to turn that away. The father circled slowly, not in challenge but in assessment, noting how the hatchlings tracked Rowan's movements more than their own parents, how their fire stabilized in his presence, and how removing them too quickly made their flames spike dangerously. Faced with the impossible reality that separation might harm their children more than proximity, the brood parents made a decision that no dragon would have believed possible weeks earlier. They did not take the hatchlings immediately. Instead, they stayed. They perched among the girders, learning the rhythms of the garage, watching how Rowan worked, how he fed and soothed their young, how he slept lightly so as not to disturb them, and how he flinched only when their fire flared too close to human vulnerability. Days passed under uneasy truce, and in that time, the brood parents saw something that unsettled them more than any threat. The hatchlings were thriving, growing stronger and calmer, learning control not through dominance but through mirrored restraint. When at last the mother gently coaxed one child from Rowan's chest, the hatchling resisted only briefly before settling against her, fire stable, trust intact, and the father realized that what the human had given could not be taken away or undone. Before they left that first night, the mother inclined her head toward Rowan in acknowledgement that carried no hint of subservience, only recognition, and though no words were spoken aloud, the message was clear. This human had become part of their children's story, and that fact would ripple outward whether any of them were ready for it or not. The weeks after that uneasy understanding were the most disorienting the brood parents had ever known, because coexistence demanded more discipline than dominance ever had, and every visit to Ironvale felt like stepping into a world that challenged the logic dragons had relied on for ages. They did not abandon the hatchlings to the human, nor did they sever the connection. Instead, they allowed a strange rhythm to form, the young spending days in the volcanic ridges under draconic guidance and nights returning of their own accord to the mechanic's garage, following instinct and familiarity rather than command. Rowan never questioned it, simply adapting his life around the presence of growing fire, reinforcing insulation, rerouting power, and learning the subtle cues that signaled stress or curiosity, treating the dragonlings not as property but as guests who would leave when ready. The parents watched from afar at first, ready to intervene if danger arose, yet danger never came, because humans in Ironvale avoided the garage without being told, sensing something unusual and choosing distance rather than confrontation. The hatchlings grew quickly, their scales hardening, wings strengthening, and most remarkably, their fire responding to emotional states with far greater precision than dragon elders believed possible. A control that scholars would later struggle to explain without confronting the role of early human contact. Word of the anomaly spread through dragon circles, drawing cautious observers and hostile critics alike, and when elder emissaries finally confronted the brood parents, demanding to know why human proximity was being tolerated, the answer was no longer defensive, it was factual. The children were healthier, calmer, and more adaptable than expected, and the proof lay not in theory but in flame that no longer lashed unpredictably at the world. To test the bond, one elder demanded that the hatchlings be kept away from Rowan for a full cycle, and the results were immediate and troubling. Restless sleep, flaring tempers, erratic fire, symptoms of stress that vanished the moment the young were allowed back into the human's presence. The realization spread uneasily among the elders that whatever had formed was not dependency but regulation, an external anchor that dragons had never considered possible. Rowan, increasingly aware that his quiet life had become a focal point for something much larger, struggled with the weight of it, fearing that his presence might endanger the hatchlings rather than help them. Yet every attempt to distance himself ended the same way, with 3 determined shapes waiting patiently outside his door, refusing to leave. When a minor industrial accident sent a shockwave through Ironvale, rattling structures and igniting fires across the district, it was the hatchlings' reaction that finally forced a decision. Instead of panicking, they coordinated instinctively, using controlled bursts to seal ruptures and shield workers, mimicking the calm problem-solving they had absorbed from watching a human mechanic face chaos with steady hands. Humans witnessed it in stunned silence, fear giving way to something tentative and unfamiliar, and dragons watching from above understood that this was no longer a private anomaly. It was a visible precedent. Confronted with evidence that human influence had not weakened their young but broadened their responses, the brood parents realized that removing Rowan entirely would not restore the old way. It would only sever something beneficial without replacing it. The question shifted from whether the bond should exist to how it could be managed without inviting exploitation or fear, and that question echoed far beyond Ironvale, stirring debates that touched ancient laws and newer anxieties alike. As seasons changed, the hatchlings' nightly returns grew less frequent, not out of rejection but out of confidence, and Rowan felt the quiet ache of a man watching something he had helped nurture begin to stand on its own. Yet whenever the young did return, curling against his chest as if reaffirming a truth neither species was ready to name, it was clear that whatever future awaited dragons and humans, it would carry the imprint of oil-stained hands, patient repairs, and the discovery that even fire could learn to rest when given something steady to lean against. The end did not arrive with a battle or proclamation, but with acceptance settling in layers, the way metal cools after long stress, because both species discovered that once something works, destroying it becomes harder to justify than preserving it. The hatchlings grew into young drakes whose wings finally carried them beyond Ironvale's skyline. Yet even as they learned the old routes and ancient skies, they returned less out of need and more out of choice, circling the mechanics district once before heading back to the mountains, a habit that confused elders and comforted parents alike. Rowan never followed them, never tried to claim permanence in a life that was not his to keep, and that restraint mattered more than any vow could have, because it proved the bond had never been about possession. Dragon councils argued for years over how to categorize what had happened. Some called it contamination, others adaptation, but no one could deny the outcome. The young drakes were stable, perceptive, and startlingly restrained in their use of fire, able to work alongside humans during emergencies without instinctively escalating to destruction. That alone changed patrol protocols, industrial zoning, and eventually diplomacy, because fear could no longer be justified when evidence contradicted it daily. Rowan aged quietly, joints stiffening, hands still stained with grease, occasionally hosting dragons large enough now to fill his entire garage, who lay coiled among machines with the same careful awareness they once showed as hatchlings, watching him work with something like reverence. When Rowan finally died in his sleep, alone on the same battered couch, the city woke to shadows passing silently overhead, not roaring, not threatening, but circling in a pattern that shut down traffic and drew people outside without a word spoken. The young drakes landed only once, briefly, placing a single, carefully fused ingot of metal on the garage floor, steel tempered by controlled dragon fire, unwarped, unburned, before taking to the sky again. No monument was raised, no treaty signed. Yet from that day forward, the disappearance of dragon young no longer triggered immediate war, and human shelters were no longer assumed to be nests of cruelty. The world did not become gentle, but it became adjustable, and that was enough because HFY was never about humans overpowering monsters. It was about being the place even monsters trusted to rest, proving that sometimes the bravest thing a species can do is offer warmth without claiming ownership, and in doing so, teach fire itself how to sleep. The truth of what had happened in Ironvale only became fully clear after the hatchlings finally left for good. Not in fear or force, but in confidence, their wings strong enough to carry memory without needing to cling to it. The brood parents returned one last time to the mechanic's garage, no longer hidden in shadow, and for the first time they spoke to Rowan not as a tolerated anomaly but as an equal presence in the fate of their young, acknowledging that what he had given was not shelter alone but a model of calm the dragons themselves had never mastered. They explained that dragons had always believed strength came from isolation, from hardening themselves against the world, yet their children had learned something different lying on a human's chest, how to listen to a heartbeat that did not demand obedience, how to rest without surrender, how to exist without preparing for violence at every breath. Rowan did not answer with pride or claims of wisdom. He only shrugged and said he had fixed machines his whole life, and broken things usually failed because no one let them cool properly before forcing them to work again. That simple statement spread farther than any decree, carried by dragons who remembered it and humans who witnessed the results. And over time it reshaped how both sides approached conflict, training, and first contact. Emergencies that once would have ended in scorched ground instead became coordinated efforts, dragons stabilizing disasters while humans guided logistics, each trusting the other to know their limits. Rowan lived out the rest of his days quietly, never famous, never honored publicly. Yet his garage became an unspoken landmark, a place dragons avoided damaging even centuries later, teaching their young to fly wide around it out of respect. When he died, there was no spectacle, only a stillness in the air that morning and the strange sight of dragons circling high above the city, silent and steady, as if standing watch. Long after the mechanic's name faded from records, the story endured, not as a myth of a man who tamed dragons, but as proof that humans did not need to dominate the ancient and powerful to matter. Sometimes all it took to change the course of two species was a willingness to offer warmth, to hold what could burn you, and to trust that even fire, when treated gently enough, might choose not to destroy what holds it. The legacy did not stop with memory or custom, because the hatchlings, now full-grown drakes, carried what they had learned into moments where instinct once ruled without question. And it was there, under pressure, that the change proved permanent. Years after Rowan's passing, a refinery fire in Ironvale spiraled out of control, flames feeding on volatile stores and threatening to tear through the district. And where panic would once have summoned evacuation alone or indiscriminate suppression, dragons arrived with precision, landing among steel and smoke with the same careful awareness they had learned as small bodies pressed to a human chest. They did not roar to clear crowds. They waited, listening, coordinating with human crews, regulating their fire to weld ruptures shut and burn oxygen away from advancing flames without collapsing structures. An act that stunned onlookers into silence because it was not dominance on display but cooperation. Elders watching from afar recognized the pattern at last. Not softness, not dependency, but control born from early trust. And resistance finally lost its footing, because results do not argue ideology. Over time, training shifted subtly across broods, young dragons exposed to humans early not to obey them, but to normalize them, to learn the difference between threat and presence before fear could harden into reflex. Humans adapted as well, building spaces meant for coexistence rather than exclusion, teaching children how to stay still, how to signal intent, how to be the kind of calm that fire responds to rather than challenges. The story of the mechanic was told without embellishment, precisely because it needed none, a reminder passed down not as legend but as instruction. When something powerful seeks warmth, do not reach for chains and do not reach for weapons. Be steady first. Generations later, when questions arose about when the age of constant brinkmanship truly ended, historians pointed to treaties and infrastructure, to protocols and shared drills, but dragons who remembered shook their heads, because they knew the truth lived earlier and smaller, in a garage that smelled of oil and patience, where 3 missing hatchlings learned that the safest place in the world could be a human's chest. And so HFY endured not as a claim of supremacy, but as a reputation earned quietly and kept under pressure, that humans were the ones who could be trusted to hold what might burn them, to fix what others abandoned, and to change the future not by forcing fire to kneel, but by teaching it how to rest. Time stretched the story further than any of its witnesses expected, thinning the details but strengthening the lesson, until what began as an accident of warmth became a standard by which first contact was measured. New dragon broods were no longer taught that humans were unpredictable hazards, but that they were variables, sometimes dangerous, sometimes fragile, always shaped by intention, and that understanding them early reduced catastrophe later. Human cities adapted in response, not by fortifying against dragonfire, but by designing infrastructure that assumed cooperation as a baseline, building landing zones instead of barricades, shared emergency protocols instead of alarms meant only to warn and flee. There were still incidents, still fear on both sides, but the difference lay in recovery. Conflicts de-escalated faster, apologies were possible, and retaliation was no longer the first instinct. Scholars eventually traced this shift back not to policy or power, but to behavioral modeling, noting how the dragons raised with human proximity showed lower aggression thresholds and higher problem-solving flexibility, a pattern that repeated too consistently to dismiss. Rowan's name resurfaced periodically in these discussions, not as a hero but as a case study, which somehow honored him more honestly than any statue could have, because it acknowledged that the change had not come from exceptional strength or destiny, but from ordinary competence paired with empathy. Dragons who had never met him still visited Ironvale out of tradition, circling once above the old district before continuing on, and humans learned to recognize that silent pass as a sign of respect rather than threat. By the time the first mixed response disaster unit was formally established, human engineers and dragon responders trained together from the outset, the world had already accepted what it once would have denied. That coexistence was not a fragile experiment but a stable system when nurtured early. And in quiet moments, when young drakes curled instinctively near human heat sources without knowing why, elders allowed it without correction, because some lessons were not meant to be unlearned. The future did not belong exclusively to fire or flesh, strength or ingenuity, but to the space where both chose restraint over fear, proving at last that the smallest act, a human holding what could destroy him, had scaled into a world capable of holding itself together.